The yellow school bus pulled up to Riverside Elementary, just as the morning bell rang. 12-year-old Terrell grabbed his worn backpack and took a deep breath. This was his third school in 2 years, and he knew the drill by now. New faces, new teachers, and that familiar feeling of being the outsider looking in. His mom had gotten a better job across town, which meant a better neighborhood and supposedly better schools. She worked double shifts at the hospital now, trying to give him opportunities she never had. Terrell understood the sacrifice, even if it meant eating dinner alone most nights and walking to school instead of getting dropped off. The hallways of Riverside Elementary were different from his old school. Everything looked newer, cleaner. The walls were painted in bright colors, and there were fancy displays showing student artwork and achievement certificates. Kids walked around with expensive backpacks and the latest sneakers. Terrell looked down at his own shoes, still good but clearly from last season. His first class was math with Mrs. Patterson. She seemed nice enough, introducing him to the class with a warm smile. But Terrell noticed how some of the other kids looked at him. Not mean exactly, but curious in a way that made him feel like he was under a microscope. He was one of only 3 black kids in the entire class. During lunch, Terrell sat by himself at a corner table. He pulled out the sandwich his mom had made before her night shift ended. Peanut butter and jelly, same as always. At the tables around him, kids chatted about their weekend plans, soccer practice, and birthday parties. None of them approached him, and he didn't try to join their conversations either. The cafeteria was buzzing with energy, but Terrell felt completely invisible. He put in his earbuds and listened to music on his old phone. The battery was dying, but the music helped drown out the loneliness. He closed his eyes and let the melodies transport him somewhere else. After lunch, he had to find his next class. The school was bigger than his old one, and all the hallways looked similar. He wandered around for a few minutes, checking room numbers and trying not to look lost. That's when he passed by the music room. Through the open door, he could see students practicing different instruments. There was a piano in the corner, drums set up in the back, and several violins carefully placed in their cases. The room had excellent acoustics, and even the warm-up scales sounded beautiful. Terrell slowed his pace, drawn to the music. A girl practicing flute noticed him standing in the doorway. She whispered something to her friend, who turned to look at him too. Terrell quickly walked away, embarrassed to be caught staring. But the sound of those instruments stayed with him for the rest of the day. In his last class, English with Mr. Rodriguez, Terrell tried to focus on the lesson about story themes. The teacher seemed genuinely interested in getting students to think critically, asking questions that made the whole class participate. When Mr. Rodriguez called on him, Terrell gave a thoughtful answer about character development that impressed his classmates, but even small victories felt hollow when you had no one to share them with. After school, instead of heading straight to the bus, Terrell walked past the music room again. This time it was empty except for the teacher, who was organizing sheet music at her desk. The instruments were all put away, but he could imagine the sounds they made. He lingered for just a moment before continuing to his bus. The ride home took 45 minutes. Terrell watched the neighborhoods change outside his window, from the well-maintained houses near school to the apartment complexes where he lived. His mom wouldn't be home until late, so he'd have the place to himself for hours. Their apartment was small but clean. His mom always made sure of that, even when she was exhausted from work. Terrell dropped his backpack by the door and went to the kitchen for a snack. There was a note on the refrigerator reminding him about his chores and telling him there was leftover pizza in the fridge. He heated up 2 slices and sat at their small table to start his homework. Math problems, reading assignment, and a worksheet about the Revolutionary War. Nothing too challenging, but he took his time to make sure everything was perfect. Good grades were important to his mom, and he didn't want to disappoint her. As evening approached, Terrell finished his homework and settled into his usual spot on the couch. He turned on the TV but kept the volume low. The apartment walls were thin and he didn't want to bother the neighbors. He flipped through channels, not really watching anything in particular. Around 8 o'clock, his phone buzzed with a text from his mom. She was checking in from work, making sure he'd eaten and asking about his first day. Terrell typed back that everything went fine, knowing she had enough to worry about without hearing about how lonely he felt. He went to bed early that night, listening to the sounds of the city outside his window. Cars driving by, distant music from someone's radio, the hum of air conditioning units. Tomorrow would be another day of trying to fit in, of sitting alone at lunch, of being the new kid who didn't quite belong. But as he drifted off to sleep, Terrell's mind wandered back to that music room. Something about it felt different from the rest of the school. Music had a way of speaking to people that went beyond words, beyond social barriers. Maybe, just maybe, that room held possibilities he hadn't considered yet. His mom always told him that every ending was also a beginning. Starting at Riverside Elementary felt like an ending to his old life, but maybe it could be the beginning of something better. He just had to be patient and keep his eyes open for opportunities. Tomorrow was a new day, and anything could happen. 3 weeks into his time at Riverside Elementary, Terrell thought he was starting to find his rhythm. His grades were solid, and a few classmates had begun including him in casual conversations. But some challenges were harder to navigate than others. The group project in social studies became his biggest test, yet Mrs. Chen had assigned teams of 4 to research different states and present their findings to the class. When she announced the groups, Terrell found himself paired with 3 other students, Kevin, Ashley, and Daniel. Kevin was one of the popular kids, always surrounded by friends and seemingly confident about everything. Ashley was quiet but smart, the type who always had her hand up with the right answer. Daniel played on the school soccer team and wore expensive athletic gear every day. They seemed like nice enough kids individually, but as a group they had a dynamic that didn't include him. Their first meeting was during lunch in the library. Terrell arrived on time, ready to contribute and maybe finally connect with some classmates. But when he sat down at their designated table, the conversation was already flowing about weekend plans and inside jokes he didn't understand. "So our state is Colorado," Kevin announced, pulling out a notebook that looked more expensive than anything Terrell owned. "My family went skiing there last winter, so I know a lot about it already." Ashley nodded enthusiastically. "My cousin lives in Denver. She could probably help us with some local information." Daniel was scrolling through his phone. "My dad has connections with some business people there. We could get real insider information for our presentation." Terrell cleared his throat. "That sounds great. What should I research? Maybe I could look into the history or the geography?" The 3 of them exchanged glances that lasted just a second too long. Kevin shrugged. "Sure, whatever. We've kind of already divided up the main parts, but you can help with whatever's left." For the next 20 minutes, Terrell watched as his teammates planned out their entire presentation. They would meet at Kevin's house over the weekend to work on the display board. Ashley would handle the economic research since her family knew about investments and business. Daniel would cover sports and recreation because of his athletic background. "What about the historical timeline?" Terrell suggested. "I'm pretty good at organizing information chronologically." "Oh, we're doing that too," Ashley said, not making eye contact. "But thanks." When the meeting ended, Terrell felt more invisible than ever. His teammates walked away chatting about their weekend plans while he sat alone, staring at his empty notebook. He'd been assigned busy work, fact-checking their research and helping organize their notes. Important maybe, but definitely not equal. The weekend meeting happened without him. On Monday, Kevin casually mentioned they'd gotten tons of work done and would probably just need him to help with final touches. Terrell nodded and said that sounded fine, but inside he felt the familiar sting of being left out. As the project deadline approached, his grades in other classes started slipping slightly. Not because the work was too hard, but because his confidence was shaken. When you spend all day feeling like you don't quite belong, it becomes harder to focus on anything else. That's when Mrs. Thompson noticed him. Mrs. Thompson taught music and had been at Riverside Elementary for 15 years. She was known for having high standards, but also for genuinely caring about her students. She'd seen Terrell walking past her classroom several times, always slowing down when he heard music coming from inside. On this particular Wednesday, Terrell was having his worst day yet. The social studies presentation was tomorrow, and his teammates had basically told him his contributions weren't needed for the actual presentation. He would just stand there while they did all the talking. During lunch, he'd overheard them joking about how they'd carry him through the assignment. After the final bell, Terrell found himself walking past the music room again. But this time Mrs. Thompson was in the doorway organizing some sheet music. She looked up and saw him approaching. "You're the new student, right?" she said with a smile. Terrell? He was surprised she knew his name. Yes, ma'am. I've noticed you walking by here quite a bit. Are you interested in music? Terrell felt his cheeks get warm. I just like listening to it, I guess. Mrs. Thompson's smile turned into something that looked almost like pity. Well, listening is important, but maybe you'd like to try making some music yourself? Before he could respond, she continued talking, but her tone changed slightly. We have all these beautiful instruments just sitting here. Of course, learning to play them properly takes years of training and, well, certain kinds of background knowledge. Another teacher, Mr. Peterson, appeared behind her with a smirk. What's this about music appreciation? I was just telling Terrell here about our instruments, Mrs. Thompson said. Though I imagine someone from his background might find classical music a bit challenging to understand. The words hit Terrell like a slap. Someone from his background. He knew exactly what she meant. And it wasn't about his previous schools or his neighborhood. It was about the color of his skin and the assumptions that came with it. Mr. Peterson chuckled. Maybe he'd prefer something more contemporary. You know, rap or hip-hop. Actually, Mrs. Thompson said, walking over to a violin case. Maybe we should let him try something classical. It might be educational. She opened the case and carefully lifted out a beautiful violin. The wood was polished to a rich golden brown, and the strings looked perfectly tuned. It was clearly an expensive instrument, probably worth more than everything Terrell owned combined. Here, she said, holding it out to him with what looked like a helpful smile, but felt like a challenge. Why don't you give it a try? I'm sure it will be a learning experience. By now, several students had stopped in the hallway to watch. Word spread quickly in middle school, and within minutes there was a small crowd gathering to see what was happening. Terrell could hear whispers and giggles from the audience that was forming. Go ahead, Mr. Peterson encouraged, his voice dripping with fake enthusiasm. Show us what you've got. Terrell looked at the violin in Mrs. Thompson's hands, then at the growing crowd of students, then back at the two teachers who clearly expected him to embarrass himself. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest and his palms getting sweaty. This was supposed to be his moment of humiliation. The new kid, the outsider, the boy who didn't belong, about to prove just how out of place he really was. The teachers were probably expecting him to hold the instrument incorrectly, maybe screech out some horrible sounds, and provide entertainment for everyone watching. Some of the students had their phones out already, ready to capture whatever disaster was about to unfold. Terrell could imagine the video spreading around school, cementing his reputation as the kid who couldn't even hold a violin properly. Well, Mrs. Thompson said, still holding out the instrument. Are you going to try it or not? Terrell took a deep breath and looked around at all the faces watching him. Some looked curious, others seemed to be suppressing laughter. A few appeared genuinely interested in what would happen next. He thought about his mom, working her double shifts to give him better opportunities. He thought about his grandmother, and the lessons she'd taught him about dignity and perseverance. He thought about all the times people had underestimated him because of how he looked or where he came from. Then he reached out and took the violin. As Terrell's fingers wrapped around the violin, memories flooded back to a time when music wasn't just something he listened to, but something that lived in his soul. Nobody at Riverside Elementary knew about his secret, and he'd planned to keep it that way. But sometimes life has other plans. 4 years earlier, when Terrell was 8 years old, he lived with his grandmother while his mother worked to save money for their own place. Grandma Rose was a small woman with gentle hands and eyes that sparkled when she talked about music. Her apartment was tiny, but it felt like a palace to young Terrell because it was filled with the most beautiful sounds he'd ever heard. Grandma Rose had been a music teacher back in the day, though she rarely talked about those times. When she did mention her past, there was always a sadness in her voice. She would say things like, back then there weren't many opportunities for people like us, or I had to teach music in churches and community centers because the fancy schools wouldn't hire me. Terrell was too young to fully understand what she meant, but he knew it had something to do with the color of their skin and the way the world worked back then. What he did understand was that his grandmother could make magic happen with a violin. Every evening after dinner, Grandma Rose would take out her old violin case from the closet in her bedroom. The case was worn and scratched, held together with tape in some places, but inside was the most beautiful instrument Terrell had ever seen. The violin was old, probably from the 1920s, with a deep amber color that seemed to glow in the lamplight. "This belonged to my teacher when I was young," she would tell him. "She gave it to me when I graduated, said I had a gift that shouldn't be wasted." Grandma Rose would sit in her favorite chair by the window and play for hours. Sometimes she played classical pieces that sounded like stories without words. Other times she played spiritual songs that made Terrell feel like crying and laughing at the same time. Her fingers moved across the strings like they were dancing, and the bow glided so smoothly it seemed to float through the air. "Can you teach me?" Terrell asked one evening, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. His grandmother's face lit up brighter than he'd ever seen it. "You really want to learn?" From that day forward, Terrell's real education began. Every day after school, he would rush to his grandmother's apartment for his lesson. She started by teaching him how to hold the violin properly, how to position his fingers on the neck, how to draw the bow across the strings without creating harsh sounds. It was harder than it looked, and for weeks all he could produce were squeaks and scratches that made them both laugh. "Music is like learning a new language," Grandma Rose would say patiently. "First you learn the alphabet, then words, then sentences. Pretty soon you'll be telling whole stories." She was right. By the end of his first year, Terrell could play simple melodies. By his second year, he was working on actual songs. His grandmother taught him to read sheet music, explaining how the little dots and lines on the page translated into the sounds that filled the room. "Classical music tells us about the people who wrote it," she would explain, while teaching him a Bach piece. "This composer lived hundreds of years ago, but when you play his music, you're having a conversation with him across time." Terrell loved those conversations. He learned pieces by Mozart, Vivaldi, and Beethoven. His grandmother would tell him stories about each composer, about the times they lived in and the emotions they put into their music. She taught him that music wasn't just about playing the right notes at the right time. It was about feeling the music in your heart and letting that feeling flow through your fingers. But their time together was limited. When Terrell turned 10, his grandmother's health started failing. She had good days and bad days, and on the bad days her hands would shake too much to play. But she never stopped teaching him. Even when she couldn't demonstrate techniques on the violin anymore, she would guide his fingers, helping him find the right positions and encouraging him to keep practicing. "Promise me something," she said one evening, her voice weaker than usual. "Promise me you'll never let anyone tell you that music isn't for people like us. We've been making beautiful music longer than anyone can remember. It's in your blood, baby. Don't let anyone take that away from you," Terrell promised, not fully understanding how important those words would become. Grandma Rose passed away just before Terrell's 11th birthday. She left him her violin and all her sheet music, along with a letter that his mother read to him through her tears. In it, his grandmother wrote that music was a gift that should be shared, but only when the time was right. Until then, it could be his private treasure, something that belonged only to him. For the past year and a half, Terrell had kept that promise to himself. He practiced in secret, usually in the small bathroom of their apartment because the acoustics were good and the neighbors couldn't hear him as clearly. His mother knew about his playing, of course, and she was proud of his skill, but she also understood why he kept it private. At his previous schools, Terrell had learned that being different often meant being a target. Kids would make fun of anything that made you stand out, especially if it was something they didn't understand. Classical music wasn't exactly popular among most 12-year-olds, and being good at it would probably just give bullies more ammunition. So he kept his gift hidden, practicing when nobody else was around, playing for an audience of one. Sometimes he would play his grandmother's favorite pieces and imagine she was sitting in her chair by the window, smiling and nodding along with the music. He'd gotten good. Really good. Not just good for a kid who learned from his grandmother and internet tutorials, but genuinely talented. He could play complex pieces from memory, had developed his own style and interpretation of classical works, and could sight read new music with ease. But nobody at Riverside Elementary knew any of this. To them, he was just the quiet new kid who sat alone at lunch and didn't participate in extracurricular activities. They saw someone who probably couldn't afford music lessons or instruments, someone whose background didn't include exposure to high culture. Now, standing in the hallway with Mrs. Thompson's violin in his hands and a crowd of students watching expectantly, Terrell felt the weight of his secret. Part of him wanted to pretend he didn't know how to play, to give them the performance they expected and avoid drawing attention to himself. But he could almost hear his grandmother's voice in his ear, reminding him about the promise he'd made. Music was in his blood, she'd said. It was his gift, and gifts were meant to be shared. The violin felt familiar in his hands despite being a different instrument than his grandmother's. It was well maintained and perfectly tuned, probably worth several $1,000s. The students around him continued to whisper and giggle, phones ready to record whatever happened next. Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Peterson watched with expressions that were trying to look encouraging, but came across as condescending. They clearly expected him to struggle, maybe even to fail spectacularly. This was supposed to be a lesson about knowing your place, about understanding what you could and couldn't do based on where you came from. Terrell took a deep breath and adjusted his grip on the violin. The familiar weight of it against his shoulder, the feel of the strings under his fingers, the balance of the bow in his right hand, it all came rushing back like greeting an old friend. He closed his eyes for just a moment and thought about his grandmother. Then he positioned the bow against the strings and prepared to show everyone at Riverside Elementary what 4 years of love, dedication, and secret practice could accomplish. The hallway fell completely silent as Terrell raised the violin to his shoulder. Even the whispers stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the air conditioning and someone's locker slamming shut somewhere down the corridor. Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Peterson watched with barely concealed smirks, clearly anticipating the disaster they thought was about to unfold. Several students had their phones out, ready to capture what they assumed would be an embarrassing moment they could share and laugh about later. Terrell felt the familiar weight of the instrument against his neck and shoulder. The violin was different from his grandmother's, newer with a brighter tone, but his muscle memory kicked in immediately. His left hand found its position on the neck while his right hand held the bow with the proper grip his grandmother had drilled into him thousands of times. He took one final breath, thought of Grandma Rose sitting in her chair by the window, and drew the bow across the strings. The first note that emerged was pure and clear, cutting through the silence like a beam of light. It wasn't the screech or squeak everyone expected. It was beautiful. Terrell began with Bach's Air on the G string, one of his grandmother's favorite pieces. The melody started softly, almost like a whisper, and grew gradually more complex. His fingers moved along the fingerboard with precision, finding each note exactly where it needed to be. The bow glided across the strings as if it were floating, producing sounds that seemed impossible to come from such a simple instrument. The change in the crowd was immediate and visible. Phones that had been ready to record a failure were now capturing something extraordinary. Students who had been preparing to laugh found themselves mesmerized instead. The hallway, which moments before had felt like a stage set for humiliation, transformed into an intimate concert hall. Mrs. Thompson's smug expression melted away, replaced by shock and then something that looked like embarrassment. Mr. Peterson's mouth actually dropped open as he realized what was happening. This wasn't the amateur fumbling they'd expected. This was masterful playing that belonged in a professional concert hall, but Terrell was just getting started. As the Bach piece reached its conclusion, he transitioned seamlessly into Vivaldi's Spring from the Four Seasons. This piece required more technical skill, with rapid finger movements and complex bow techniques. Terrell's left hand danced along the strings, executing runs and trills that most adult musicians would find challenging. The music seemed to tell a story. You could hear birds singing in the high, quick notes. There were gentle breezes in the sustained melodies and sudden spring storms in the dramatic passages. Terrell's face was peaceful, almost serene, as if he were having a private conversation with the composer through the music. More people began to gather. Teachers from nearby classrooms stepped into the hallway to see what was happening. The school's principal, Dr. Martinez, appeared at the end of the corridor and slowly made her way through the crowd. Drawn by the incredible sounds, Kevin Ashley and Daniel, Terrell's teammates from the Social Studies project, stood near the back of the group with expressions of complete amazement. The same boy they had dismissed and excluded was producing music that none of them could have imagined possible. As the Vivaldi piece built to its climactic finale, Terrell's playing became more passionate and expressive. His whole body moved with the music, not in a showy way, but as a natural extension of the emotions flowing through the violin. The technical difficulty of what he was playing became secondary to the pure artistry of his performance. When he finished Spring, the hallway remained absolutely silent for several long seconds. Then someone started clapping, and within moments the entire crowd was applauding enthusiastically. Some students were actually cheering, but Terrell wasn't done yet. Without pausing, he launched into a piece that showcased even more of his abilities, Paganini's Caprice No. 24. This was violin music at its most challenging, requiring lightning-fast fingerwork and bow techniques that pushed the instrument to its limits. It was the kind of piece that professional violinists use to show off their skills. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Terrell's fingers flew across the strings, executing passages that seemed humanly impossible. The music was wild and passionate, full of dramatic leaps and intricate patterns that required years of practice to master. His bow work was equally impressive, creating sounds that ranged from whisper-soft to powerfully dramatic. Mrs. Thompson looked like she might be sick. The realization of what she had done, the assumptions she had made, was written clearly across her face. She had tried to humiliate a student based on prejudice and ignorance, only to discover that he possessed more musical talent than she had seen in her entire teaching career. Dr. Martinez pushed through the crowd to get a better view. As the school's principal, she had attended countless student performances over the years, but she had never heard anything like this in a school hallway. The technical skill was impressive enough, but the emotional depth and maturity of Terrell's playing was extraordinary. When the Paganini piece reached its thunderous conclusion, the applause was immediate and overwhelming. Students were shouting compliments, teachers were shaking their heads in amazement, and several people were wiping tears from their eyes. Terrell lowered the violin slowly, as if coming back from somewhere far away. The hallway that had felt hostile and uncomfortable just minutes before now felt warm and welcoming. Faces that had looked at him with indifference or mild curiosity now showed genuine respect and admiration. "That was incredible," someone called out from the crowd. "How long have you been playing?" another voice asked. "Where did you learn to do that?" The questions came from all directions, but Terrell found himself looking directly at Mrs. Thompson. She stood frozen near her classroom door, still holding the violin case, her face a mixture of shame and disbelief. She started to say, then stopped. What could she possibly say after what had just happened? Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her professional demeanor barely containing her excitement. "Young man, that was absolutely remarkable. I had no idea we had such talent in our school." Terrell felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the attention he was receiving. It was the same feeling he used to get when his grandmother would smile and nod after he played a piece perfectly. It was the joy of sharing something beautiful, of connecting with others through music. "Thank you," he said simply, handing the violin back to Mrs. Thompson, who took it with trembling hands. The crowd began to disperse slowly, with students continuing to congratulate Terrell as they passed. Many of them introduced themselves, apologizing for not talking to him sooner and asking if he'd like to sit with them at lunch tomorrow. Kevin, Ashley, and Daniel approached him together, looking genuinely ashamed of how they'd treated him during the group project. "Terrell," Kevin said, his voice much different than it had been during their library meeting, "we owe you an apology. We were completely wrong about everything." "More than wrong," Ashley added. "We were unfair and rude. Would you maybe want to start over with the project, as real partners this time?" Daniel nodded enthusiastically. "We'd be honored to work with you." Seriously. As the hallway finally emptied and the normal sounds of school returned, Terrell realized that everything had changed. The secret he'd kept for so long was finally out. And instead of bringing the humiliation and rejection he'd feared, it had opened doors he never knew existed. But more importantly, he had honored his grandmother's memory and kept the promise he'd made to her. He had refused to let anyone tell him that music wasn't for people like him. The gift she had given him was no longer a secret treasure. It was something he could finally share with the world. The next morning, Terrell walked into Riverside Elementary to find that everything had changed overnight. Students who had never spoken to him before were calling out greetings from across the hallway. Teachers who had barely noticed him were stopping to chat and ask about his musical background. The invisible boy had suddenly become the most talked about student in the school. But the biggest change was in Mrs. Thompson. She was waiting for him outside her music room before first period, looking like she hadn't slept much the night before. When she saw him approaching, she took a deep breath and walked over to meet him. "Terrell," she began, her voice much different than it had been the day before. "I owe you an enormous apology. What I did yesterday was inexcusable." Terrell stopped walking and looked at her carefully. He could see genuine regret in her eyes, but he'd learned to be cautious about adults who suddenly change their tune. "I made assumptions about you based on things that had nothing to do with who you are or what you're capable of," she continued. "I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment, and I'm ashamed of myself." Other students were walking past them, and several slowed down to listen. Mrs. Thompson seemed to realize they had an audience, but she didn't stop talking. "I've been teaching music for 15 years, and I've never heard anything like what you played yesterday. Not from students, not from some professional concerts I've attended. You have a gift that's truly extraordinary." "Thank you," Terrell said quietly, not sure where this conversation was heading. "I'd like to make this right if you'll let me," Mrs. Thompson said. "Our advanced orchestra has an opening for first chair violin. It's usually reserved for students who've been in our program for years, but your skill level is far beyond what we typically see. Would you be interested?" Terrell felt his heart skip a beat. First chair meant leading the entire violin section, being responsible for the most challenging parts and setting the tone for the whole orchestra. It was an honor that most students worked years to achieve. Yes, I'd like that very much," he said. Mrs. Thompson's face brightened for the first time since he'd known her. "Wonderful. We practice every Tuesday and Thursday after school, plus some Saturday rehearsals before concerts. And Terrell, I'd also like to arrange for you to have private lessons with a professional instructor. The school has a fund for exceptional students who need additional support." As they talked, Dr. Martinez approached them with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to follow up on yesterday's remarkable performance." She turned to Terrell with the kind of respect usually reserved for adult colleagues. "I've been making some phone calls this morning. The district's fine arts coordinator wants to meet with you. There are scholarship opportunities for gifted young musicians, and I think you'd be an excellent candidate." Terrell felt overwhelmed by how quickly things were moving. Just 2 days ago, he'd been the lonely new kid eating lunch by himself. Now adults were talking about scholarships and private lessons. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez continued. "We're having our annual spring concert in 6 weeks. Mrs. Thompson and I would like you to perform a solo piece if you're interested. It would be in front of the entire school and all the parents." The thought of performing for such a large audience was both terrifying and exciting. Terrell thought about his grandmother and how proud she would have been to see him sharing his gift with so many people. "I'd love to do that," he said. The rest of the day continued to bring surprises. At lunch, instead of sitting alone, Terrell found himself at a table full of students who were genuinely interested in getting to know him. Kevin, Ashley, and Daniel had completely changed their approach to the social studies project, asking for his input on every decision and treating him as an equal partner. "We were wondering," Ashley said as they worked on their presentation, "would you maybe want to hang out this weekend? My family is having a barbecue and you're totally invited. And there's a soccer game on Sunday if you're into sports," Daniel added. "I know you're probably busy with music, but it could be fun." For the first time since starting at Riverside Elementary, Terrell felt like he actually belonged somewhere. But the most meaningful moment came during his first orchestra practice that Thursday. When he walked into the music room carrying his grandmother's violin case, the other students greeted him with genuine excitement. They'd all heard about his hallway performance, and many of them had seen the videos that were still circulating around school. Mrs. Thompson introduced him to the group and explained that he would be taking over as first chair. Terrell expected some resentment from students who had been working toward that position for years, but instead, he found enthusiasm and curiosity. "Could you show us how you do those really fast finger movements?" asked a girl named Christina who played second violin. "That piece you played the other day was incredible," said David, the lead cellist. "Could you teach us some of those techniques?" As they began their first rehearsal together, Terrell realized something beautiful was happening. Instead of his skill creating distance between him and his classmates, it was bringing them together. The other students weren't intimidated by his abilities. They were inspired by them. Over the following weeks, Terrell's influence on the orchestra was remarkable. Under his leadership, the group's overall performance improved dramatically. He helped struggling students with technique, suggested new interpretations of familiar pieces, and brought an energy and passion to rehearsals that had been missing before. But perhaps more importantly, his presence changed the culture of the music program. Students who had never considered joining orchestra started showing up to practices. Curious about this amazing musician their friends couldn't stop talking about. The music room, which had sometimes felt exclusive and intimidating, became a place where anyone interested in learning was welcomed. Mrs. Thompson watched these changes with a mixture of pride and humility. She had learned a lesson that would influence her teaching for the rest of her career. Talent and passion could come from anywhere, and her job was to nurture those gifts, not make assumptions about who possessed them. 3 weeks before the spring concert, Terrell made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I want to start an after-school music program," he told Dr. Martinez during a meeting about his solo performance. "For kids who can't afford private lessons or don't have instruments at home." Dr. Martinez raised her eyebrows. "That's quite an ambitious project for someone your age." "My grandmother always told me that music should be shared," Terrell explained. "There might be other kids out there who love music but don't have the same opportunities I had. I want to help them discover what they're capable of." Within a week, the program was approved. Terrell would work with Mrs. Thompson to teach basic music skills to younger students twice a week after school. The district agreed to provide loaner instruments, and several community members volunteered to help with funding and transportation. On the night of the spring concert, Terrell stood backstage preparing for his solo performance. His mother was in the audience, having taken time off work to be there. It was the first school event she'd been able to attend since they'd moved to the district. As he tuned his grandmother's violin, Terrell thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The lonely boy who had walked into Riverside Elementary just a few months ago felt like a different person entirely. When his name was announced, Terrell walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. The auditorium was packed with students, parents, teachers, and community members who had heard about the remarkable young musician. He had chosen to play a piece his grandmother had taught him years earlier, a beautiful melody that spoke of hope, perseverance, and the power of music to bring people together. As the first notes filled the auditorium, Terrell felt his grandmother's presence with him, guiding his fingers and encouraging him to share his gift with the world. The performance was flawless, but more than that, it was deeply moving. When he finished, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Through the bright stage lights, Terrell could see his mother in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she applauded. Mrs. Thompson walked onto the stage and took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that Terrell represents everything that's best about education and about music. He reminds us that talent and dedication can flourish anywhere, and that our job as educators is to recognize and nurture the gifts that every student brings to our community." She paused and looked directly at Terrell. "He also reminds us that we should never make assumptions about what any student is capable of achieving. Thank you, Terrell, for teaching us that lesson." As Terrell left the stage that night, he carried with him not just the satisfaction of a perfect performance, but the knowledge that he had found his place in the world. The secret he had kept for so long had become the foundation for a new chapter in his life, one where his gifts were celebrated and shared. The boy who had once eaten lunch alone was now surrounded by friends who valued not just his musical abilities, but his kindness, intelligence, and the unique perspective he brought to their community. And somewhere, Terrell knew his grandmother was smiling, proud that the gift she had given him was now being passed on to others, just as she had always hoped it would be.